Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Leadership Lenses. I am so happy today to welcome an old friend, colleague, and someone who is currently sitting in an office where I used to spend a lot of time, Rabbi Dr. Avery Joel, currently the head of school at Fuchs Mizrachi School in Cleveland. Avery, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Barry. And, it is funny that I'm sitting literally in your desk and in your chair, but really appreciate the time to connect and with a good friend, colleague, and mentor.
Amazing. Amazing. And thank you. I know you guys are going through some excitement in the summer, building expansion, lots of stuff going on. So I really do appreciate you taking the time. And I think we can all acknowledge it is fundamentally your desk at this point. You are doing an amazing job. One of the things that I really enjoy most is looking back and seeing in the 10 years since I've been in Israel, just how much the school has grown, developed on so many levels. And that actually is part of what I really wanted to discuss with you today. A couple of the things I know you're doing, and I also will know that you've been gracious enough and your approach is to be really open both about what you have figured out and what the struggles still are, which I think everybody listening is going to be able to really learn from. And I want to deal with today, we'll get to two topics that are on the minds of many heads. One is developing your lay leaders, lay leadership pipeline, board training, board development, how we make the best impact possible there. And the other is how we engage most effectively with our parent body. So there's obviously overlap, but we're going to treat them as two separate topics and hopefully be able to give some insights, thoughts, and some takeaways for people listening on both. So why don't we start on the lay leadership side? I know you've been running a program for a couple of years to try and get at this, but rewind for us and tell me, like, what were the problems and challenges you were facing that led you to start thinking about the area?
Sure. It's a topic that I feel passionately about. We were a number of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we're looking at a lay leadership that was functioning at a very high level, but was kind of aging out of their role in the school. And we were asking questions about who was going to be the next wave of leadership, and we didn't have obvious answers to that. And we started just wondering, is there a way that we could do a better job of ensuring that constant pipeline, where we were able to engage in whatever process that might look like and give whatever experiences necessary to people in our parent body and in our community who would then be able to grow in their lay leadership and be ready for those next steps when those times came. So that was really the challenge we were looking at. We weren't sure who the next couple of presidents were going to be, and that was concerning to us.
Right. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, you kind of looked at this and said, we look around the room, we look around the community, we don't see the right people there. And often that's where we get stuck. The next step, which is what you said just now, is, and therefore we decided to try to create them. We decided to try to educate them, to grow them, we're not going to bring new people into Cleveland, for the purpose of being a board member at Fuchs Mizrachi School. But we have people here, and what can we do to get them ready? So I'm curious, like, what does that mean? How did you think about taking someone and helping prepare them to be an effective lay leader?
So I definitely did not know the answers to those questions when we started this exploration. And so it started with connecting with different people to learn about what lay leadership training looks like and having some internal conversations about what we want of our lay leaders ultimately. And so I connected with different people. Dr. Erica Brown was very helpful in talking it through and in steering me towards other programs that had been created, I would say primarily for the federation world. I connected with our local federation as well, and some partners there and got some guidance. And we also had some strong current lay leaders who were integral in pushing this, supporting it, and being partners. And Jeff and Danielle Wild played that role and ultimately helped us even secure funding through a grant so that we could do this. So it was a lot of learning for me, even in terms of what training programs are out there from the Mandel Foundation, from the World of Federation, and what would be different about this that we would say, you know what, we want to create something unique for Jewish day schools and maybe more specifically for the Fuchs Mizrachi School in a way that we could learn from those programs and at the same time tailor them to what we were looking for in terms of the experiences and the skills that we want.
Right, absolutely. And I love the looking and learning from federations because federations are built around lay people in a way that day schools aren't, just by our structure. And federations often have staff and the ability to resource and support their lay leaders in a completely different way. So we sometimes discount them because we're saying, like, well, we're a school, we can't do what they do. But there is what to learn. And I'm curious, when you learned and you brought in from all these various programs, what were the pillars of your approach? And what kind of, when you get down to it, what kind of training and learning were you trying to give to these incoming and, up and coming lay leaders?
So it's interesting. In talks with the Federation, we were trying to see how could we do something that would be additive to things that they had. We're blessed with a very strong partnership with our local federation, and our hope would be that people who are involved in the school are also involved in federation and vice versa. So we definitely didn't want to simply replicate a program. We almost saw it as one leading to the next. Where we landed was trying to create a process through which our lay leaders would ultimately have some sense of shared language around lay leadership in school, some knowledge of some leadership frameworks that we like to incorporate and use in our school, and understanding the context of our school. So ultimately, we landed in a place where we structured 6 2-hour sessions. The first one really related to the individual lay leader, getting to know them a little bit better, even though we have a small community. Even for the cohort of, we had 6 to 8 people in our 2 cohorts so far, getting to know each other, but then also learning about their leadership journeys, doing some strength analysis of the individual. We've been using Clifton Strengths, or Strengths Finders, as tools to help us get into what are the things that we lean towards and what might be areas that we want to have other people support us in. That was the first session. The second one, we did a little bit more about history, culture, and mission. And the way we've handled that is by bringing in school founders. We're fortunate that there are founders who still live in our community, and we brought them in to talk about the founding of the school. What were those challenges? That session was actually, based on the feedback that we got, the most impactful. When these aspiring lay leaders were able to hear about why the school was started, what were the sacrifices that the founders had to make initially, literally coming to meetings and figuring out how they're making payroll that week, things that they had to sacrifice, unbelievably inspiring for our lay leaders. And we combine that with talking about culture and learning about culture, what contributes to culture, and how can we shape a culture in the way that we want it. After that, we moved into things related to being a change agent. So 2 sessions that were related to teams, the framework of conscious leadership, which we talk about a lot, perspective taking, listening, feedback. Those were some of the tools and frameworks that we then did in those middle sessions. We then did governance and financial leadership. So some of that was about specific to our school, our financials, what are our main levers? How do we play with those levers in ways that ultimately help us aspire toward fulfillment of our mission? And the last session was really a graduation and conversations around where do we go from here? What does leadership moving forward look like for these lay leaders? How can we continue to grow the cohort?
That's amazing. So I want to just to put this into perspective, right? Many schools end up doing one board training a year, right? Some of us end up with one board training every other year, and we might do like a 2 or 4 hour training. So what you did with these people over 6 2-hour sessions was the equivalent of somewhere between 4 to 6 years of the training they would get if you just put them on the board, right? So like you really cover a number of areas. I'm also struck by the fact that you brought them together as a cohort. I'd love to hear more about that because, like, who wants to be a lay leader, right? Who wants to be president? I think in one of Rossov's research pieces, Alex Thompson described the president as the person who said, not it, last. So that's where we are. What did it do to the dynamic for you to start building these cohorts?
Let me first speak to, I think, who our ideal target is when we put this together. And then I'll tell you how it actually played out, because it played out a little bit differently than we intended. Initially, we thought this would be a great stepping stone to the board. That prior to engaging as a trustee, as a board member, they would have gone through this experience. Hopefully, they've been involved in some committee work, right? They've shown that they are someone who has a desire to be engaged and has demonstrated some skills. But really, ideally, before they're running any committees, before they're a board member, that was really our target demographic. When we then went ahead and tried to put together a first cohort, we realized that there were people sitting on our board who we thought still had a long runway of engagement. And why should they not have this training experience? And so our first cohort really was almost exclusively board members. The two people who were not board members, after being involved in this, then became board members. And I would say our second cohort, similarly, there were people who had already been engaged for a long time in different ways. And we wanted ultimately our board to have this shared experience. Our hope is the next cohort that we're going to kick off this fall will actually be what we had initially thought. People who are not yet on that level and engagements, and people who we then see as coming into it. So the cohort model was always a goal to have a shared experience and shared language. And in a way where we know as lay leaders, we want them to be functioning as a cohort and working together. So if they're going to get that experience now, wonderful. And for the people who are not yet engaged as committee chairs or board members, it might also help them broaden their network of potential lay leaders in a way that they can get some more exposure and learn from other people.
I love that. And I also love the fact that you're, speaking to this as an educator. So we know, and I've quoted this before, first time with her president, Jane Talbot Cohen, who talks about the head as the employee of the board and also the teacher of the board. And that is crucial. And what I hear from you is very much an educator's perspective that you're bringing into the boardroom. I'd love to hear how that how did that affect the way the board has functioned? If you've actually been training board members, what's been different about your boardroom for the last couple of years since you started this?
So 2 points to make about that. Number one, when even we conceived of this, we initially thought that we were going to bring in a facilitator. That whether we hired one person to facilitate the whole program, or maybe depending on the topic, we would bring in other people. And ultimately, we landed on me facilitating the program. Again, I mentioned we brought someone in for the history of Mizrachi. At our graduation, we've brought people in to also talk a little bit about leadership and give a little bit of a charge to the cohort. But I think there was surprising value in me facilitating these sessions in terms of my relationship with these people and the way that they saw me as an educator. I remember after one board training, a past board president said to me, "Wow, Avery, you're actually like really good at this." And I said, I went into education. Like, that was my field, moved into
Before
leadership.
I became a head of school, I was in education.
Exactly. And so I think there has been tremendous value in the confidence that the lay leaders have in me and my relationships with them, even individually, as me being the educator and approaching it that way. We've this mindset, I would say, has spilled over into the boardroom, where we've tried to make our board meetings less of sort of like, okay, here's how we're going to report out for each committee, and it's going to be very standard, and we're not really engaging our board members when we do that. And we've shifted now, and I think it's been helpful that they've already had some of this. We've shifted where the board meetings are now, besides, when we have to pass a budget or tuition, things like that that are a little bit more technical, but we do try to bring some of these things into the boardroom. So engaging in conversations around a topic that's really important to our mission, but bring in some of the perspective taking tools that we've learned. And so it might be a conversation related to what are the goals of our spring event, and are we making decisions and implementing in line with what we're actually trying to accomplish? So I could open that up to a conversation to a 20-person boardroom and exactly how that's going to go. Or we could
Right.
think of approaching it in a different way with flexing the muscles that maybe they've been starting to use throughout this experience in the Emerging Leaders Program.
Do you end up having like a facilitated conversation or different kinds of interactions because you've set the tone that that's how you work with the board?
Exactly. Like the same way that in the Emerging Leaders Program, we'll break up into small groups sometimes and then come together and share out. We'll do the exact same thing in a board meeting. So we'll break up into small groups, give some structure to what those small group conversations are going to be, and then have people come back and have a reporter report out. But thinking it a little bit more as a session. Maybe it's a working session and not a learning session, and that's okay. But approaching it from that educational mindset and thinking about, all right, how can we actually accomplish what we want to accomplish? I know you've written about this, approaching events and saying, wait, what are we trying to accomplish before we just do this because this is what we do? whether it's the annual meeting, something like that. So it has crept in now into our board meetings, and it doesn't feel uncomfortable now that so many of our board members have gone through this.
Of that. I think that's amazing. I love the shift to really being an educator. And I love the shift. I was thinking as you were describing that, like, that doesn't sound like a board meeting. Working in groups and like getting stuff done and enjoying it. That's that's pretty awesome. And that's amazing that you shifted that culture. And at the same time, I imagine a lot of heads listening to this and being like, well, that's an entirely new program. And I kind of have a full-time job. So there's no way I can do this. You must have been in a similar situation. What would you say to people listening who are like, "Okay, there's no way I could find time to do anything like this?"
So, first of all, I definitely would have been reluctant in my first few years as a head, both because I was still just getting my sea legs and didn't feel like I had a great grasp over what the job takes, and because I'm not sure I would have had sort of like the buy-in to be the facilitator of that in my first couple of years. So that would be one thing. I do think anytime anybody says, well, I don't have the time for that, sometimes when we say that, we're talking about things that if we actually invest the time are going to save us time in the end, right? Either qualitatively or quantitatively. So for me, this was something I was actually passionate about. And I know that if we didn't do something about this, then play that out. What's going to happen? So we're going to have ineffective lay leaders. Then what's going to happen to my time, right? So I think it's just a smart use of time to think about things like this. This comes up with coaching. People say, I can't add time to my schedule. I don't have a minute free. Where am I going to receive coaching and mentoring from? But in the end, qualitatively, if it totally shifts, it's like instead of adding an app to your phone, upgrading the system. And that allows you to work with different efficiencies. And so to me, it was definitely something I was passionate about. And I knew there was support for it. And so it did take time. I will say, going into the second cohort, which we completed this year, took much less time. I had already prepped everything. And so I made tweaks. So year one took a lot more time, but it was a valuable investment for what we were trying to accomplish.
Right, right, and I do think that anytime anyone says to me, "I don't have time for coaching," that's somebody who is absolutely in need of coaching, right? And I've been there myself, so, yeah, I don't mean that negatively in any way, but you can find the 45 minutes a week to work with a coach that's gonna enhance your work across the board, and what you're saying is you found the time to create this educational program for your lay leadership that's gonna transform the way that you spend all of your time running the school in partnership with these lay leaders.
And I think we have to be real. It is about priorities. So, you can't just always add things because they're important. Something has to give. I think you'd probably say, many of us would, that as long as those decisions are intentional and conscious decisions, it's not just happening to you, they could be really smart and strategic decisions that people make.
Absolutely, absolutely, and they lead down a really important road, right? And there's a lot more that we can talk about on this, and we'll come back to on the end and ask you if there are pieces that you could actually materials and that sort of thing that you might be able to share. But I
Happy to.
also want to touch on the second topic here, which is the topic of parents and parent engagement, because so many of the heads that I speak to these days are struggling with this. It feels like it's a new generation of parents. It feels like the culture is different, or maybe it like just got harder somehow, and we're not sure how to engage it. I know there's things that you've done, and we've also talked about what you're still working on. So, what's your approach? How do you deal with the parent engagement challenge?
But let me start by saying we have not, solved it, right? And there probably isn't a solving it entirely because we're talking about people and people are complex and a lot of people have a lot of different needs. What I am happy to share is a couple of things that have worked for us in trying to do a better job. We recently did a parent survey, and it was clear to us that we continue to have work that we need to do. And so we are strategizing around where are we missing the mark in parent engagement. There probably is something to kind of the new generation, but sometimes I feel like that's a cop out. And,
Mhm.
and the reality is like there's still people, and I wish I remember where I heard this line, but I love it. Every complaint is a request. And so when people are upset with something, what is it that they're really saying that they want or need? Is that in line with what we can provide and we also agree is important? And then how do we do it? So generations are different. They might things needs might manifest differently, but there's always stuff that we can do to do a better job. I'll share two initiatives that we started. Both ideas actually came from a lay leader when they initially started and have now existed for several years. One I'll talk about relates to one of the ways that I try to communicate with the parent body. It actually started over COVID when there were just so many questions that parents had. There was a ton of angst that everybody was feeling. And I, as a head of school, I think it might have been my third year as head of school. So I still have no idea what I was doing. And certainly when COVID hit, I felt like I don't know any answers to any questions that anybody has. And I'm not going to communicate until I have answers. And there was a parent that suggested that I do a Zoom and I speak to the questions. And even if it meant naming some of the questions that we had and not and sharing some of our thinking, even if it was nothing conclusive in that moment, we tried doing that. We had at the time, I don't know, maybe 200 families in our school. And when I would do what we were starting to call a head of school Zoom, I was getting 150 screen on those.
150 out of 200 families were there.
Correct.
Wow.
Correct. There's not a single email I could send out that would ever get that many eyes unless it was something like free tuition, you know, very hard to do that. And I started doing almost every 2 weeks a head of school Zoom where I would give an update on what we were thinking about. And I would ask for people to give me questions before the Zoom, that specific questions they wanted me to address. And they could also send me messages on the Zoom. The chat at a certain point we made it private after learning lessons. We made private so they could send questions directly to me. And I would basically present what I wanted to present and then go through the chat and answer questions that people had when it was appropriate to answer it and to answer it publicly. We recorded them and sent them out for people who couldn't come. And the feedback that we got was tremendous appreciation over us being transparent and sharing. And even if people disagree, for sure, people disagreed with COVID decisions. Uh, Even when people disagreed, knowing that there was a thought process, or even if I was sharing a question we had, parents feeling reassured that the same questions they had, they now know that we also had those questions and we're looking into it. So we got tremendous mileage out of just being in communication in that way. And when COVID was done, I really wanted to figure out how to continue to use that as a way to engage parents and to think about, can we continue to utilize this? So I still do every, I would say 4 to 6 weeks ahead of school Zoom, where I'll send an email out to the community saying, are there specific topics that you'd like me to speak to? And managing it the same way. One of my frustrations is I rarely get a response to that email about with a parent suggestion for, hey, can you speak about this topic? It's just something I want to learn more about. Or I'm hearing a lot of parents talk about this at the Shabbos table, and can you talk more about it? So that rarely happens, which again is just one of my frustrations, and I don't know what I need to do in order to create that type of culture in our school where people feel really comfortable saying, hey, you know what, can you speak more about this? So that's a nut we still have to crack. And I would say now, our school's grown, so we have more families. We probably have 230, 240 families, but I'll still get, even without sort of like a hot topic on the agenda, I'll still get 50, 60 screens, and we'll still record
Wow.
it and we'll still send it out. So I know people still appreciate it. I'll sometimes even, if there's a topic that's kind of festering in our community, then I'll use that vehicle to say, you know what, we're going to talk about whatever it is. An example that came up this year, which some people may or may not think is a really important topic, snow days. So
No days.
there was a lot of chatter in our community around school decisions around snow days. So I said, okay, let's name it. Let's do a head of school Zoom. I'm going to tell you what our policies are, what our approaches are, what we think is working well about it, what might be challenging, what we're willing to look into, etc. So that's how we've used that head of school Zoom vehicle.
Amazing. So I want to just pause and kind of categorize this. And I framed it as the parent engagement challenge, but obviously the right way to refer to it is as the relationship, right? Because like you said, we're dealing with people. All relationships always need work. And so what you've just described, I think, is a fascinating way of engaging broadly with the parent body in transparency and communication. I know a lot of heads have thought of the idea of some sort of town hall, but it can be really threatening to think about an open floor, open, discussion with 50 families. And the way you're doing it on Zoom obviously is somewhat more convenient, but also allows you to moderate the discussion so that you can deal with difficult issues without quite that same level of risk. So you can really go out there and do that.
There's a double-edged sword to it. For sure, it gives me and the school a little bit more control over the conversation. And that's by design, right? I want it to be that way. Again, bringing 50 families together, I think it would be challenging for that to be a constructive conversation without it kind of devolving into like a mob mentality. And so I do think this is a better vehicle. The trade-off is maybe that's what's sort of like leading to people not really sharing questions. Maybe we get more of a back and forth if you're doing it live. And that was again, a decision that I made knowing that that was going to be the trade-off, right? You're not getting as much input on the parent side. Something that's the other thing that we did, which maybe was a way for us to try to get more on the parent side. I mean, I mentioned we did a parent survey, but we also have a parent school liaison team. And this was designed to make sure that I and we as a school have our finger on the pulse of the parent body. And
Right.
so
So it's parent school liaison team, but this is not a PTA. This is something different.
we have a separate parent council or PTA. This is a group that exclusively was pulled together to, I would say, ensure, let's call it bilateral communication. And so we come together 4 or 5 times a school year. And really the goal is that I know what people are talking about and that there's at least this forum for me to also share school perspective. And if those people then go back to it's a representative group. They're not a board committee, but we do try to get people from a lot of the different social groups in the school and the different demographics. And the goal is that they're coming, having spoken to a lot of their chevra, they're coming to these conversations knowing what their chevra is saying and feeling about a topic. And that also when they go back after our conversation, they can also, we don't assign them, we're not asking them to be ambassadors. We're not giving them that responsibility, but at least they know what the school perspective is on some of these topics. And we'll handle it the same way where we ask them, okay, what are people talking about that you think we should address? Sometimes there isn't something that's really percolating, and we'll say, okay, well, we think this is something we want to know what the parents are saying about. I can remember last year we wanted to know more about sort of the dynamic between fundraising and events and how many asks were were we bringing to parents, whether it was for fundraising or for registering or athletic fees or whatever. Is that something that was festering among our parents? So we made that a topic for our parent school liaison team, because we could speculate all we want inside the walls of the school, but what's the reality out there, and making sure that what we are sensing is what's really real.
Right. Wow. I love the way this just like completed two sides of the coin, right? Because the head of school Zoom is you sharing, but it sounds like this is more, and I want to be clear, like this is a scary thing to do. You're bringing in a bunch of parents and you're saying, tell me what people are saying around the Shabbos table about the school, which as a head also we're thinking, tell me what they're saying about me. And I want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly, because if I hear it, then we can talk about it and we can work on it. Where I want to just really underscore that that's not a simple thing to do, but I imagine it can really be game changing if you actually hear what people are upset about, what people are happy about as well. And then you can have that kind of communication. I'm also curious what it did for the people who are on that liaison committee. Did they start to feel like your partners in a different way?
So it's a good question. It's been interesting to sort of see. So first of all, I will say we are selective about who's on this committee. We want to make sure that the people who are part of this team are people who are, first of all, are respectful. And even if they're going to share something that might be hard for me to hear, they're doing it with the school's best interest in mind. They're maybe not jumping to conclusions, and they're approaching it with curiosity, and they want to learn more about it. And that ultimately, their heart's in the right place. It's not true for everybody. And so we are selective about the types of people so that we can have those open and constructive conversations in a way that, you were talking about sort of how threatening that could be. So it makes it less threatening. I know that everyone there are people who are really in it for the school. And even if they're going to share something difficult, we're all on the same team, and we're rowing in the same direction. So that's been really helpful. It's been also, to your question, it's been interesting to kind of see, after we get to have those experiences, how many of those people do we then look at and say, you know what, this person might be really good to chair a committee or to be a future trustee, or maybe that person should come to the next cohort of the Emerging Leaders Program. And so that's been really interesting. And for sure, they appreciate this insight into the thinking of the school. I mean, I know parents are going to disagree with decisions we make. That's always going to be true. And that was a lesson that I learned, I would say, pretty intensely over COVID, where every decision you knew half the people were going to support and half the people were going to think was incorrect. So I think parents really appreciate knowing that actually the school has thought about this issue, has considered different things, made a decision because there were reasons behind it, as opposed to assuming that, well, someone just got up one day and decided to make a bad decision. Uh,
Hmm.
and and there are
Which is
things
so easy to assume when you're not talking to each other.
for sure. And on the school side, we're guilty of that too. We do that also. I can't believe parent X did this. Whatever. And I will say there are specific topics that we've actually and policies that we've changed because of some of these conversations. So it's definitely something that we probably need to do a better job communicating to our school community the role of the parent school liaison team, the conversations that have come up, the changes that have come about because of that. So we're probably not getting as much out of it as we can, and that's some of the work we need to do.
Tell me what else you're thinking. We have a couple minutes left, but what's the next frontier of parent engagement and parent relationships?
So I love that question, and I have a lot of thoughts that we don't have time for. But I will say one challenge that I think a lot of schools are in, and I'm not exactly sure yet what to do about it. The WhatsApp groups. So WhatsApp groups are a big challenge, and I think we're kind of looking at a little bit of a challenge for us right now of in some segments of our school population, an us versus them mentality, and that's I think particularly trying for our school. Our school is based in a very specific community geographically, and a third of our parents work in the school. And so that makes for a lot of complex dynamics and a lot of blurred boundaries. We spent the last year coming up with guidelines on relationships and boundaries. And so we wrote it up. I call them guidelines more than policies, and they relate to some teacher student relationships. I mean, we're in a community where every teacher is asking their students to babysit for them. And if we made a policy where we couldn't ask our students to babysit for our families, we'd be in big trouble. And we have Shabbos meals together, and like it's just complex. So it requires some navigation. But what is also the parent teacher and parent school relationship? What can parents expect from us in terms of those relationships? And what can we ask of parents? So that's something that we've worked on kind of as a document. Our challenge is now, how do we bring it to life? And how do we make sure parents feel like we see them and we hear them and we want this relationship to be strong in a way that currently, at least some of our parent body we're hearing, doesn't really feel that way. And that's a challenge.
Absolutely. And it is such a challenge to do that at scale, because what I hear you doing in the head of school Zoom is you're able to reach out as broad as you want because everybody can show up. When you get to the liaison committee, obviously you can't have 50 people in the room because you're not going to be able to have a conversation. But everybody who's in the room, you're able to break down that us versus them because you're all together. The more people you can bring on the inside, the better. And when you started talking about guidelines, I think it's really helpful because you need those guidelines not to keep people out, but to help them engage and come in the right way. So we're not saying separate. We're saying we have to figure out how to strengthen the relationships in a healthy way.
And I mean, you're so right that the more you bring people in, the stronger those relationships are. And we also know it's very easy for there to be emails that get misunderstood or written with a certain intensity, let's call it, that wouldn't happen face to face. Like face to face is always going to be better, but how do you do that at scale? And for a school like ours, you mentioned we're expanding, like our community is growing. And so how do we make sure we do that with a growing school? And that's going to mean making this not a head of school exclusive effort, but how do we engage the senior leadership team? How do we engage the teachers to see that these relationships with the parents are very important? And how can we contribute to strengthening them in a way that brings people in different ways? The one other challenge I'll say that we're grappling with is, are there more opportunities to bring people in? I mean, there are only so many volunteer opportunities. Not everybody's even available at times when the school would need volunteers. Even when there's more interest in volunteering, how can we come up with meaningful engagement opportunities and not just engagement opportunities? That's something that we're actively talking about and trying to solve or at least improve.
Right. And I do think that opening that you just threw out there of this can't just be a head of school thing is one of the keys. Because just like with committees, or any other task that you have, the head can only be in one place at a time. And if we want to engage parents broadly, somehow we have to learn how heads, how senior leadership teams, how teachers can all play that role in the relationship building, which I think it goes all the way back to what you said about having time to run the board trainings. As a teacher, you may not want to spend time engaging with parents, but putting in that time to build the parent relationships makes your job as a teacher much easier and much more effective and allows you to focus on the right things down the line and over time.
1,000%. Couldn't agree more. And I also know that's going to take time. And for teachers too, for teachers to grapple with that same question. I don't have any time. I'm prepping, I'm grading, I'm following up on so many different things. Teachers don't have that time either. And so part of this starts with just learning together about the importance of these relationships and how it really does ultimately set the school up and really the children up for success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think on the note of time, we're going to wrap up now, but I do want to come back and ask if it's okay if people reach out to you, both so that you can share materials that you may have from your leadership development program for your lay leaders, to ask you questions, obviously, or to hear or see any artifacts you may have from some of the parent engagement pieces you've gone on, the guidelines you talked about, so they can learn. If they want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to call?
Yeah, I love talking shop. I could talk about this for forever. So please, open invitation for anyone to reach out to me. The best way is probably just to start with an email, which you can find my email address on our school website, fuchsmizrachi.org. And I would love to talk, and not just in terms of what I can share. If anyone is doing something in one of these realms that could contribute to what we're trying to accomplish, I would love to learn about.
Amazing. Amazing. And thank you so much. And I hope that the people that are listening understand that these are big ideas. This isn't like, hey, I'm going to adjust this meeting by 10 minutes and we'll take care of it tomorrow. These are big ideas that, as Avery has shared, take years to develop. And that's why I love doing this particular conversation during the summer, because now is a time when you can actually think about where you want your board to be in 3 or 5 years, what you want parent relationships with the school to look like in a number of years' time, and try and take some of the pieces that we've been talking about here, becoming an educator for the board, investing not only in finding board members, but in growing and educating board members, building parent relationships with the transparency, that bilateral communication, and think about which of these you may want to incorporate as you're looking at next year, big picture. And you're welcome to contact Avery, as he mentioned.
Yes.
You're also welcome to reach out to me. I'd love to hear what you think and how these ideas resonate with you. As always, you can reach me, Barry Kislowitz, on LinkedIn, Leadership Lenses on Substack, or on our website, kislowitzconsulting.com.